Hi there, it's June the 9th, and we continue our journey through the book of Acts, written by Luke, who also authored the Gospel. This is a sequel to his story about what happened with the early church. And we're in chapter 7, and we're reading from verses 1 to 29 in chapter 7. We saw then that Stephanos, one of the people who's been appointed to administer the food distribution in the church, is a man of great power in the Holy Spirit who has done miracles. He's also a great teacher, and now he finds himself in front of the ruling council of the Jews, accused of speaking against the temple and against the law of Moses. And so Stephen begins his defense. Now, there's some very interesting things to note here, because I said before that Stephen says some of the things that carry over into Paul, and Stephen here is making some points that are really important to note. So Stephen really begins to unpack the Jewish story. He goes back to Abraham, and interestingly, he goes back to Abraham being called from Ur of the Chaldees. And then he traces the story of Abraham making of the covenant of circumcision that he then brings to his sons, and that then passes on through his children, and then the story of Joseph, who is rejected by his brothers and taken into Egypt, and then Moses, going to Moses and God speaking to Moses, introducing himself as the God of his fathers, and Moses coming to the people, but actually being rejected initially by the people. Now, there are a couple of things here in this that I want us to be aware of. First of all, Stephen talks about the importance of these people, of the persons in the story, more than the places. Remember that he's been accused of speaking against the temple and against Moses. The temple seems to be the real priority. But Stephen is kind of building the case here to show that these things were actually in place before the temple was established. God was speaking to people. Not only was God speaking to people, but he was speaking to them in foreign places. He wasn't speaking to them in Israel. He wasn't speaking to them in Canaan. God's voice is not limited to one place. And so God speaks to Abraham in Ur of the Chaldees. He speaks to Moses in Midian. And he speaks to his people at Sinai. None of those places are within the promised land. So Stephen is making a point here that God is not limited to a place. The next thing that Stephen is pointing out is that the people of Israel have a history. They have, as part of their story, is the rejection of what God is doing and the deliberate misunderstanding of it. And so he points this out with Joseph. First of all, Joseph is rejected by his brothers, and they sell him into slavery in Egypt. Moses is rejected by the people, even when he's bringing the words of life. The people reject what he's doing. Now, this is going to lead to Stephen's culmination of his speech later on, when he says that they've also rejected the Holy Spirit. He's saying both things. He says God is not tied to this temple. He's been speaking to us in places long before the temple was established. All of the patriarchs he mentioned in Moses, none of them are around when the temple was around. And then he's also saying that even when God speaks, the people tend to reject what's being said. These are things that Stephen wants his hearers to hear, because they are so focused on the temple and so focused on it as being the power center, their power structure. We'll come on to that a little more later. One thing that comes through clearly here is Stephen's understanding, grasp of this story. It's so important that we grasp story, because story is what forms us. Story leads us to where we are now, and we are included in that story. And Stephen is giving us the understanding of the story so that we can see that the key thing is the relationship with God. It's not what we're doing right now. It's not what we think right now. It's actually what God has done and how he has included us in his story, in history. Let's today be aware. Let's be more aware of the story than we have been ever before, and let's see that we are being grafted into, we are being included into this amazing story of redemption, which is culminated in the coming of Jesus. Have a very good June the 9th.